welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're calling in from, probably good morning because most folks are probably on the Pacific Coast. Welcome to this special webinar where we're announcing the Western Thanksgiving Monarch count numbers from this past fall. Before we get started, going over a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, if you have any questions, we'll have lots of time for questions today. Please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. In addition, if you want to use captions, you can click the CC icon at the bottom of your screen and see a few different options for that as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to a couple of presenters that we'll have today. We are joined today by Isis Howard and Emma Pelton, who are both monarch conservation biologists for the Xerces Society. And we do also have a special guest with us today, which I will let Isis introduce. So thank you everyone so much for being here. Thank you, Emma, Isis, and Susan. And Isis, I will pass it off to you.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you everyone who's attending today. We're really thrilled to announce the results of the Western Monarch count from fall of 2023. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so before we get to the numbers, quickly for those of you tuning in, we are from the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We're a science-based nonprofit focused on protecting and conserving the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We have several programs, including an endangered species conservation program, pollinators, an agricultural biodiversity program, a pesticide reduction team, and a community engagement team as well. Continue to next slide. And I want to emphasize before we get started that everyone has a role to play in Western monarch conservation. Western monarchs are in crisis. They've declined by more than 95% in the last 4 decades. And there's a role for everyone, whether you're a community member, a professional conservationist, someone who loves to garden and loves looking at pollinators and bugs in your backyard, of any age. So ultimately, monarchs are one of these incredible creatures that spans many different environments across North America and beyond. They don't really care where you're from or how much you know, but they're going on this epic journey each year, spanning hundreds to thousands of miles, and your community can serve as a way station or a place for them to rest, recharge, or breed or overwinter. So we'd love for you to take action and join us in this effort to provide excellent habitat and help them recover. Next slide. So today we're going to be announcing the grand total for the overwintering Western monarchs. Western monarchs are the butterflies that breed and overwinter and migrate west of the Rocky Mountains, whereas the Eastern monarch butterflies are those butterflies that are breeding, migrating east of the Rocky Mountains, and these are the butterflies that go and overwinter in the Oyamel fir forests of Michoacan, Mexico. And so we do know from past tagging efforts that there may be some exchange of Eastern and Western monarch butterflies, but they are different populations. So again, today we're going to be focusing on the population count for Western butterflies that overwinter along the Pacific coast from Mendocino County down through northern Baja, California. Next slide. Here's a closer map of the over 400 overwintering sites that are monitored for the Western monarch count each year. Adult monarchs overwinter in clusters at protected habitats along the California coast in trees that offer protections from wind, rain, and freezing temperatures from around October through March of each year. There are also a few inland sites that we monitor in the Saline Valley of California and in Arizona. Monarchs enter what we call diapause, or sort of hibernation, during these winter months, where they stop laying eggs, with a few exceptions. Now, it's late January, so if you're visiting an overwintering grove, you may see butterflies engaging in mating behavior. And this is because they are starting to mate and breed so that the females can then migrate back northward and inland to their breeding areas to kick off the spring generation. So again, there are over 400 sites in the West that we monitor. And so we'll be announcing the total from these sites, compiling them all into one grand tally. Next slide. So the Western Monarch Count as a project is an annual community science effort. It began in 1997, so this is the 27th year of the count. It runs each October through March. It's coordinated by the Xerces Society and Mia Monroe with the assistance of over a dozen regional coordinators, of which Susan Ramos is one of them. Susan Ramos is one of our special guests today. So we're thrilled to have her, and we'll share her local perspective of the East Bay later on. Additionally, data from the Western Monarch Count informs conservation efforts and allows scientists and land managers and community members to not only advocate for, but also to protect and manage monarch overwintering sites in the West. Next slide. The Western Monarch Count is powered by volunteers, partners, and funders. This year, we had a record 400 plus participants sign up to participate in the Western Monarch Count. Our volunteers attend a virtual and field training to learn standardized survey protocol to learn how to count butterflies and estimate the number of monarchs clustering at an overwintering site. So these folks are contributing hours and days of their own time to help us track the population and assess monarch habitat in the West. The standardized protocol allows scientists to compare counts from year to year and between sites. There were over 500 monarch count surveys submitted in the Thanksgiving count or fall count of 2023, but over 1,000 surveys have already been submitted for this entire overwintering season, and data keeps rolling in. So it's truly an incredible heartbeat. We're so grateful for all the incredible volunteers and participants and funders that help make this work possible. Volunteers are truly the heartbeat of the Western Monarch Count. Next slide. So here are the numbers. This year, participants counted 233,394 monarch butterflies across 256 overwintering sites in the West. The population tally is lower than last year, about 100,000 lower, but similar to fall of 2021. The survey period for this tally was a 3-week period between November 11th and December 3rd, 2023. This 3-week period aims to capture the height of clustering monarchs, or the peak number of overwintering monarchs at our overwintering sites in the West. We then take the data that's submitted during that 3-week period, select the highest count from each of the sites that meets protocol, and tally it together to come up with this final population tally. The Central Coast of California continued to host the majority of butterflies. Approximately 76% of this grand tally were counted in San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara County. Next slide. Here's a graph that represents this year's count tally with the additional context of the last 27 years. So from 1997 up to this fall, 2023, you can see that there's been a decline in the Western monarchs overwintering along our coastline, despite a general upward trend of volunteer coverage of overwintering sites. So volunteer coverage, that's the number of sites monitored per season. That's represented by this blue line. And then the green bars show the total monarchs counted or reported at our overwintering sites each year. Next slide. So folks are often curious about the sites with the highest counts. This year, we had a repeat top count. So just like last year, the highest count was at a private site in Santa Barbara County owned by the Nature Conservancy. This site hosted 33,080 butterflies, that is not open to the public. However, the second largest counts were conducted at the Pismo State Beach Monarch Butterfly Grove. They had 16,038 butterflies at their peak. I was just out there yesterday and there's still over 10,000 butterflies. So if you're curious about seeing the overwintering monarchs, Pismo State Beach Monarch Butterfly Grove in San Luis Obispo County is a great place if you live or can travel to the Central Coast. Now they're going to be leaving soon, so if you do want to visit, I'd encourage you to check out some of these public sites in the next couple weeks. The third largest site was for 10,029 butterflies at Morro Bay Golf Course, again in San Luis Obispo County. Okay, continue. So you might be wondering, why was this year lower? Do we know why we saw less monarchs at our overwintering sites this year? Again, the answer is pretty nuanced. It's really difficult to pinpoint exact reasons that influence naturally fluctuating invertebrate population, but we think that perhaps last year's storms, the back-to-back atmospheric rivers in December and January, may have played a role in reducing the spring breeding population, leading to a slight decrease in the numbers that we saw this winter. So if you remember our announcements of the New Year's count last year, the New Year's count is this 2-week survey period following the Thanksgiving count period. We check to see how monarchs are faring through the overwintering season. Well, last January, we found the largest intraseasonal decrease on record of 58%. So that means that from the fall, November, December count to the December, January count, we saw 58% less butterflies. And this could have been due to mortality from winter storms, disease, or predation at overwintering sites. It could also indicate movement between or away from overwintering groves. So again, take that number with a little bit of nuance, but we did see the largest intraseasonal decline last winter, meaning that the generation of butterflies that goes out to the milkweed patches in spring may have been smaller than past years. Additionally, from summer surveys, we saw lower numbers across the breeding season, with the exception of numerous sightings in southwestern Canada. Now, the population of Western monarchs continues to be small, just 5% of what it was in the 1980s, and it's vulnerable to fluctuations in chance. We published a blog about the bounciness of butterflies. So if you're curious to learn more about why this kind of fluctuating population is typical of at-risk invertebrates, you can read, again, the bounciness of butterflies at Xerces.org and select our blogs. Next slide. Also, if you're curious to check out counts from your region, we encourage you to go to westernmonarchcount.org and check out our interactive map. The Western Monarch Overwintering Site Viewer, with a QR code here to access it, allows you to select overwintering sites in your region. This is a really zoomed out picture of the tool, but you're able to use the plus and minus icons to zoom into your county or region, select an orange dot or overwintering site, and learn about the site-specific counts that have occurred each year at that grove. Next slide, please. Additionally, when you go to westernmonarchcount.org, you can click the Data tab and then select View and Download WMC Data to download an Excel file with the sites listed out with their site ID and name and county that they belong to, with the counts from 1997 to present. And we are putting links in the chat right now in case you would like to check them out. We also include the population graphs in this Excel sheet. So if you would like to use that population graph for any of your own outreach purposes, that is also available to you in that Excel sheet that you can download for free. Next slide, please. And last but not least, before I hand this over to Emma Pelton, I do want to plug this call to action from a UC Davis researcher. Dylan MacArthur Waltz is hoping to call on community scientists to continue surveying Western monarch overwintering sites in efforts to find out when monarchs are leaving or disaggregating from their overwintering sites. So if you'd like to help Dylan out with his research, please continue counting or surveying monarch overwintering sites in the West. You can continue submitting data to westernmonarchcount.org, just like you did for the Thanksgiving and New Year's counts. We will then take care of the rest and send all that information to Dylan. So, you don't have to follow protocol as seriously, but Dylan's really curious about when the groves are empty. So from January through March, please continue, if you can, weekly to go out to these groves and check for butterflies and then send us your data. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emma, who's going to explain a little bit more about the threats monarchs are facing, the conservation efforts underway to help them, and some additional initiatives that we're taking part in to support monarchs as best as possible. So with that, Emma.
Great. Thanks so much, Isis. And thank you all for being here. It's really a fun day in our annual overwintering project, which I feel like the season lasts as long as it lasts for the butterflies. We're pretty busy on our team from October through March, and it's really a nice highlight in January to kind of step back, take stock of where we're at, and then be able to share this with all of you. So just a huge thank you for being here, and all of you who are listening, who participated and made this possible. So we often get the question, why are monarchs in trouble? Why have we seen this decline in the Western population and in the Eastern population? So I think this is my really short, here are the top reasons that researchers and the body of literature we have to date really point to. And I think the biggest message I like to share with folks is it's not one thing. We think there's probably multiple stressors going on over time, which is both bad news because there's not going to be one solution that solves it. But the good news is there's a lot of different facets that I think a lot of different people can play a role in. So when it comes to habitat loss, we know this is a big issue across wildlife species, not just for monarchs. But for monarchs specifically, we've really seen loss and degradation of those overwintering groves in coastal California. I will talk a little bit more about that specific issue, but it's a huge secondary besides the counts and the numbers that we get a lot of the glory for. I think really getting monitors out to get eyes on the groves and document what's going on, what issues there might be. And unfortunately, we get a lot of reports every year about damage to overwintering sites. So this is a major issue and a major lift that we'll talk more about, but it's very much where we put a lot of our effort outside of the count here at Xerces. And then much more broadly, we know that we've lost a lot of the milkweed habitat, specifically in agricultural areas. This is really well documented in the upper Midwest, but we suspect that we've lost milkweed in different parts of the West, including in the Central Valley of California and definitely in our urban and suburban areas, although we do see incredible community efforts to bring milkweed back in those landscapes as well. So trying to find ways to bring milkweed back on the landscape, to bring in other plants that they need in other parts of their life cycle. Adults can use a really wide range of flowers. So bringing in native gardening and rewilding areas across our landscapes can be part of that solution. Another big threat are pesticides, and that's an umbrella term for a lot of different chemicals that target, specific taxa. So specifically for monarchs, we think about the impact of herbicides, which, as that name suggests, targets plants, and insecticides, which target insects. And then there are other chemicals that can also harm monarchs, but those are kind of the two big groups that we think about the most, because herbicides can remove plants that they might need from the landscape, and insecticides could directly kill monarchs or can do things that we call sublethal effects that might impact the longevity, how long they live, how many offspring they have, how well they can fly. And there's an increasing body of research, including some work from the University of Nevada, Reno, and our staff here at Xerces, really documenting how widespread contamination of milkweed is that we're putting out in the landscape for restoration, coming from nurseries that might be using practices to minimize harm to their plants while they're growing them, but then maybe expose monarchs to harm out in the landscape. Anecdotes from people that bought, let's say, a milkweed plant at a local big box store and then find that when they have caterpillars on it, they die. So we've had multiple kind of mass death events from that, as well as just contamination that's occurring from agricultural applications and then urban and suburban applications as well. So I think it's one of the more unsung issues that we really like to bring to the forefront, because it tends to be a little bit of a harder conversation than creating habitat is also trying to scale back the pollution that we're putting out in the environment. Finally, climate change. We think that this has not necessarily been the #1 driver of why we've seen the decline in the last few years, but it's certainly, I think, moving forward, going to be a big threat. And we've seen specifically damage to overwintering sites due to increasing severity, frequency of atmospheric rivers, wildfire, and then we think that, impacts like drought over the course of their breeding season can have impacts in the overall numbers that we see. But it's not always one thing. It's not always good or bad. Some aspects of climate change, I think, are benefiting populations on a small level in local ways. And then at a broad scale, we think this could be threatening a population that's already suffering from habitat loss and pesticide contamination. And then we don't want to forget that there could be other factors at play. One of them we think, at least locally, and we definitely see, is the impact of non-native predators, OE, and this can really happen in urban environments where we see a lot of stressors that can occur at more of a local scale. And if we kind of add those up, could be having population level impacts. So here's another fun graph. This one's a little bit denser than the graph that we share more broadly. But this is courtesy of Cheryl Schultz and Elizabeth Crone, two great researchers. And if you want to check out the original paper, this is a modified version from the population viability analysis, Schultz et al. 2017. We have, if you really want to nerd out, we have the whole paper and all its supplements posted on our Western Monarch website. But essentially, this was some work that Cheryl and Elizabeth and others did a few years ago to look at how vulnerable is the Western population to collapse. And so back then, we were looking back at data that stretched to the early 1980s. That's equivalent. We don't have as much of it, but it's equivalent in terms of survey effort and by professional biologists that kind of go before the Thanksgiving count got started in the late 90s. But you'll see that the y-axis is kind of a nonsense axis, but this is a log scale. So essentially, we estimate that there were low millions of butterflies regularly in the 80s. It fits with anecdotes that stretch back to even like the late 1800s, that there were a lot of butterflies on the California coast. And in the 90s, the population started to decline. It had a little bit of a rebound in the late 90s, right around the time that the count started. And then we saw this decline around 2000 through the mid 2010s, where we hit a new normal, where we thought, okay, a couple 100,000 butterflies is where we're at. And then we saw in 2018, that bottom really dropped out of the population and we dropped below 30,000 butterflies. And in 2020, which was an anomalous year in terms of weather, so there could have been other factors, we saw them drop below 2,000 butterflies. There was a lot of widespread concern that we had seen the population, the migration collapse. And so there was kind of a huge reckoning, I think, when 2021 rolled around and we saw them bounce back. And so I think, again, that blog, Bounciness of Butterflies, which Cheryl Schultz wrote with Xerces, is a great resource as we all tried to wrap our head around it, and a lot of hypotheses and kind of why that was possible. And the fact that the Eastern and Western populations are not completely separate probably had a role to play. We know there was some more uptick of winter breeding in the East Bay in a relatively mild winter. So there could have been a few factors, but we did bounce back. And so essentially, I think the takeaway at this point is we have bounced back to what we would have considered normal-ish numbers a few years ago. But it's actually not even quite to what the average was in the 2000s. So we've bounced back, but maybe not quite all the way. And we still estimate we're down about 95% from the 1980s. So if you want one takeaway, and I went way too much into the weeds with the math there, I think the big takeaway is all this bouncing around, we're bouncing on a really low number. We're still way below what we were at a few decades ago. So now I'm just going to briefly talk about threats related to overwintering sites, because this is really the twin element to our effort with the Western Monarch count. So when our volunteers and partners go out, including a picture taken by Candace, our Santa Barbara regional coordinator, who's been monitoring this site in Carpinteria. It's the Chevron site owned by the Chevron Corporation. She went out to this site to do her monitoring. This site hosted almost 900 butterflies 2 years ago. She saw active cutting of the cluster trees, and she kind of zero butterflies clustering. So these trees weren't completely cut down is our only hope. There could potentially be some regrowth, but they were topped. And there's actually a comment letter period that ends tomorrow, if anyone's so inclined. We just submitted our letter in partnership with Xerces. But this was a really disappointing situation because these were really well documented overwintering trees. And the corporation and the consultant they work with had the wrong information and worked on the wrong information and cut these trees while protecting trees down the road that do not support monarchs. So really unfortunate, and I think just really speaks to the fact that even at sites that are really well documented, the site specifically was in the coastal zone, was written into the local coastal plan as ESHA, as environmentally sensitive habitat area, and that was still not enough to protect it from getting cut. So we estimate, and we know this is probably a gross undercount, over 60 sites have been destroyed in the last 30 years. We continue to lose sites every year, and there's really limited legal protection. So massive issue, and definitely a hope we have that if the monarch is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act later this year, that potentially there will be opportunities to make sure that some of this really crucial overwintering habitat is better protected moving forward. The threats that overwintering sites face are manifold. So we have got development, we have aging groves. A lot of these eucalyptus groves were planted well over 100 years ago. They're not really long-lived trees. They're often really constrained areas. This is a picture of Lighthouse Field State Beach in Santa Cruz. This isn't a photo of the entire site, but this is the main site. This is the main area where they cluster. You'll see younger cypress trees with a in the foreground, and then the background eucalyptus trees. And so really a lot of these groves, what we're continuing to see is they get whittled away and they get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so over time that makes them more and more vulnerable because they are forests, they're going to change, they're going to grow, trees are going to fall, they're going to die. And if we don't have a plan to actively manage, we often see these groves decline over time, even with the best intentions, because we're just dealing with such small areas. We also know eucalyptus is not a really popular tree. It's convenient to none of us that they choose a non-native tree that has wildfire risk, tends to be considered a hazard, and is linked to lower biodiversity and a lot of other taxa. So that's a problem that we all have to live with, and I think really constrains especially agencies' ability to manage it proactively because it's not native habitat. No one really wants to plant more eucalyptus. Drought's making a lot of these groves stressed, which brings in pests and disease. We've seen a lot of groves burn or be threatened with wildfire or being removed or thinned because of the threat of wildfire. There's a lack of awareness about the value. We've also seen a lot of damage where utilities and rights of ways come in. And again, from a wildfire perspective or line clearance, that continues to kind of degrade because these are often along Highway 1. They're often intersecting with PG&E's rights of ways, things like that. And then in general, I think just a lack of active management or managers feeling like they have the ability, again, because this is a non-listed animal in non-native habitat, can be really challenging and tie people's hands. And then we have big knowledge gaps, and there's a small and dedicated group of people working hard to try and address those knowledge gaps. But right now it's really hard to give managers a recipe of here's exactly what to do to make this habitat long-term support monarchs. So there's a great group. I didn't make a slide about it, but there's a group of us who we're calling ourselves the Western Monarch Overwintering Science Initiative. And it's a collaborative, evolving group, a lot of different people that are interested in tackling these questions. And right now we've got two major projects. One is by Cal Poly, graduate student Kyle Neeson is working at both Pismo and at Vandenberg Space Force Base to look at forest structure and try to weave in tools like LiDAR and monitoring with infrared cameras and kind of combine it with really wonderful detailed monitoring data that state park staff have collected for a long time at Pismo Beach. And then second, we've got a project where we're exploring the use of the MODIS network, which is widely used. It's run by Birds Canada. It's widely used to understand migratory birds and their movement. So it's been around in the bird world for over a decade, and now it's starting to enter the insect world as the tags are getting smaller and lighter. So our colleagues at Point Blue Conservation Service, Xerces, and others are working together to try and understand wow, these really new lightweight tags could be deployed on Western monarchs. And we just had a field day 2 weeks ago to test them out. And we had some really promising results that the butterflies could handle the tags and that they could be picked up even in clustered and shady locations in the forest because they're solar powered, and we weren't sure how they'd perform, but that was a good early test. So a lot of us, I think, are looking and exploring that technology to try and answer questions around movement and this like January time period. How much are monarchs dying versus how much are they moving? How important are smaller groves or groves that we don't see occupied very often? So trying to get kind of peer behind what's going on by setting up passive monitoring through these tags. And then there's an active component that hopefully we could talk to you all about more next year, where we're hoping there'll be a phone app where people can go out and monitor and turn the app on their phone, and it'll pick up any butterflies tagged. So if you want to learn more, we do have a story map that I can, after I'm done, pop it in the chat. But you can learn more about both those projects. And if you yourself are, doing any research related to overwintering sites, feel free to reach out and connect with us. We want it to be a really collaborative space. And we really thank all the community scientists, because a lot of the data you all are collecting, including cluster location information, is really feeding in to research questions. And we're starting to think through what other questions could we answer with the data that you all provide.
Emma, before you move on quickly, from the Chevron site, we have a question asking if later on we can provide more information on how they can submit a letter.
Oh, sure. That'd be great. I'll pop that in the chat as well. So that's my bummer spiel about all the challenges we face at the overwintering sites, but I wanted to highlight just a couple examples of really proactive management and people bringing the community in to do some good work. So on the left, we've got Leo Carrillo State Beach, which was burned in the Woolsey fire a few years ago. It also was further harmed by multiple cutting of trees after the fact by the county and by SCE. But through a group of people, really, I think the leads being state parks, the Angeles District, and the Ventura RCD, they have been restoring the site, and it's going to take time, but making sure that we've got healthy trees in the future, and we're planting nectar, and we're thinking through how that site could bring monarchs back in the future in the Los Angeles area. And then on the right, we have Ardenwood Historic Farm in the East Bay. This is a planting event that ISIS took part in last year. And so this was planting native nectar plants to support monarchs while they're overwintering with part of the Bay Area chapter of Latino Outdoors. Also, I think Pismo Beach on the left has been a great example of a site that's been really proactive, and they are dealing with a pretty constrained area, and they have lost trees, and they lost a tree last year with the big atmospheric rivers. And so they've really been trying to replant and get proactive and think about planning for the future so that there are trees growing up that will fill those canopy gaps. And then on the right, we have an example up in Big Sur, Los Padres National Forest. This is Plaskett Creek, a site that hasn't hosted many monarchs in quite a few years, but efforts to replant trees there to fill in gaps. So these are just a few highlights of examples, but I do think there are a lot of managers and groups trying to get ahead of this and work towards restoration. So if you are not an overwintering manager, or you don't live in the coast and you're not quite sure how this could fit with what you can do, I think just zooming out, we do believe that, monarchs are a wonderful flagship to get people involved in wildlife conservation. So some of the things that people can do across North America is to restore and protect pollinator habitat in general. We very much support people planting milkweed, but we think we should also think broader and tackle insect declines more holistically by thinking about host plants for many insects, including monarchs. Participating in community science like the Western Monarch Count. Once it's not the overwintering season, another great one to get involved with is the International Monarch Monitoring Blitz, which brings together a lot of different monarch community science projects in Canada, the US, and Mexico. And they have a lot of resources in French, English, and Spanish. So look for that this summer. I also really like to plug iNaturalist. It's a really powerful tool, can auto-translate into like 90 languages. You can use it anywhere in the world, and you can use it for pretty much every living thing. So it's a great tool, and it's they've got a companion app, Seek, that helps you it uses AI technology to help you identify things. Sometimes it's a great tool, sometimes it's not a great tool. But I think that's one of those tools to help people who want to get up to speed, and especially for like common insects in your community, it can be a great like first step. And then just grain of salt that I recently shined it at a few different sparrows at my bird feeder, and it told me that I had a great horned owl. I must have merged them into one great horned owl. So Seek is a great tool within iNaturalist, but with grain of salt as that tool gets better. And finally, advocating for monarchs and other insects. And then when possible, reducing reliance on pesticides and supporting farms if you're able to that use fewer pesticides. This includes certified organic. This also includes farms that have a wildlife diversity plan, that are Be Better certified, that use IPM practices. So I think we just like to plug that as a way that you can vote with your dollars, and also be aware that like it's a wider range of choices than just organic, that people that think about trying to more holistically involve wildlife habitat on their farms. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Isis, and I'll try to pop some of those in the chat.
Okay, great, thanks. A couple last things before we hand it over to Susan and then some other coordinators. I wanted to remind people how to connect with Xerces. We have a podcast that our webinar host, Rachel, actually is a host on. So check out Bug Banter if you love learning through podcasts. And you can watch our webinars and videos on YouTube at the Xerces Society, and you can follow us on all social media platforms at Xerces Society. Next slide, please. Additionally, for our Monarch Count volunteers who are antsy because the season's coming to a close, and if any of you want to continue surveying invertebrates this spring, summer, fall, please check out the Xerces Bumblebee Atlas projects. We need help in all the green states on this map right here. So if you live in one of these green states, please check out Xerces Bumblebee Atlas project. You actually get to catch and photograph and handle live bumblebees. So it's really, really fun, a little more hands-on than the Monarch Count, but you do need to go through training. So this is not quite a 101 community science project, but more like a 102 level. So if you're interested in diving into bumblebees in your Monarch off season, please do check this out. Next slide. Additionally, we want to plug the Xerces Habitat Kit programs. You can go to xerces.org/habitat kits to learn more about this. We not only provide a great plant to give away in California, but also several other states in the United States. So whether or not you're in California, please do check out Xerces Habitat Kits. You basically send an application to us in like February usually. And then if you are selected to receive a habitat kit, we provide you with pollinator-friendly plants that have been regionally sourced for your area, all free of charge. You have to cover your transportation costs to and from our pickup sites, which again are based in the Northern California, Central California, Southern California, or if you're outside of California, they'll be based regionally throughout your state. But you just have to pick up the plants and we provide them for free, and we've sourced from local nurseries that we're partnering with that we've vetted and know provide pollinator safe plants. So if you're interested in that at all, please do check it out. We have monarch and pollinator habitat kits and several other specialized kits for you there. Next slide. And now diving into regional spotlights, we'd love to shine a light on some of the different Western Monarch Count regions from this season. Here's a photo taken last year of Bay Area volunteers at their training day. We have lots of faces in there, and I'm sure some of you are in attendance right now. Next slide, please. So we'll start off with Susan Ramos, and Susan, I'm going to hand it over to you, but for the folks in attendance, Susan is a coordinator for the East Bay. Susan hosts trainings for our Western Monarch Count volunteers, in addition to a lot of other workshops and activities she hosts through her day job, helping out with East Bay Regional Parks District. Susan has been an absolute gem and rising star in the East Bay and through the Western Monarch Count project these last several years. And so I'm just really grateful, Susan, for all the time and effort you've put in. You've definitely left a lasting mark on the Western Monarch Count project, and we're so thrilled to have you. And thank you again for taking time to share with us about your season this year.
Well, thank you so much, Isis. I really appreciate you inviting me to be on the panel this season. As Isis already mentioned, I worked for the East Bay Regional Park District as a naturalist and got involved with MIA many years ago. So I've been actually counting monarchs for about 8 years now, and have been sharing the Alameda and Contra Costa County Western Monarch Count coordinator position with Christina Garcia, who is another naturalist from the East Bay Regional Park District down at Ardenwood. And so we have about 19 sites in Alameda and Contra Costa County. And this year we had about 35 or so volunteers kind of spread out throughout the 19 different sites. And we hosted a couple of different training days for new volunteers and also kind of a refresher for some of our seasoned volunteers. And then something that was kind of special that we tried out this year was to invite some of the newer and seasoned volunteers to come along on counts at different specific sites. So we had I think we did about 8 different days, 8 different sites, and we would just tell them what the location was and where we were going and what time. And if anybody wanted to, they could just show up and count with me or with one of the other coordinators. And we had a lot of success. A lot of folks joined in, so especially some of the newer people that were just trying out volunteering for the first time, who didn't feel like super comfortable, like, oh, I don't know if I have all the protocols right, or they could just come along, and we used their eyes and helped just spread out in some of these sites and discover clusters or loners or flyers. And it was just really, really exciting to have this happening. So I think I have one more slide I just wanted to point out too. We had some really great collaboration this year. We met with some folks at a site called the Guild Track site. And so we met with some UC Berkeley interns and some of the staff there. And that was just a really great day to get some youth involved in counting monarchs. We also have a really great longtime volunteer, Michael Gold. He kind of celebrated and invited people to counts, and I sort of spread the news of different days at Albany Hill and also at Point Pinole. And Point Pinole is like this huge area where there's a million eucalyptus trees, and we're not exactly sure if there's an overwintering cluster there. There have been in the past, but anyway, they've done a lot of work kind of fixing up the habitat. So it's pretty exciting, just all these different things that have been happening. And one of the things that was real highlight for me, I actually had a couple of super amazing highlights. One was one of the things I wanted to do was like visit all of the different sites in Alameda and Contra Costa County. There were some sites that I had never been to before. And one afternoon, I went to an area called the Richmond Field Station, and it was in the afternoon, so I wasn't really expecting to see much, but it was a very windy day, and there were just like hundreds of monarchs there, which was absolutely amazing. It was, I don't know if they were like arriving to this area, and they were just like flying all around and clustering, and anyway, it was just absolutely amazing. So having different volunteers out there at different times and just kind of like checking different sites, I just get so excited about it, and so excited about people becoming involved. So that's one spot I wanted to highlight, because we have a few volunteers that go out to that site on a regular basis, but it would be great to have even more. One of the best places, I think, in the East Bay to see monarchs easily is this slide that I'm showing right now, is at Lincoln Park in Alameda. It's like super easy to get to. It's super accessible to the public, and they are not on eucalyptus, they're on a redwood tree. So it's I just wanted to point out that as well. And then this year also, surprisingly, we had a huge number of monarchs in an area called Sky West, which is an old golf course that's in Hayward. And we had thousands of monarchs there. So that was super exciting, but also a little worrisome, as it is an old golf course and there are some ideas about developing it. So that's another site that we're just kind of watching, keeping our eyes on, and also especially important to get the data for that particular site and the numbers of monarchs. So just a really super exciting season. I'm just thankful for all the people who volunteered to come out in Alameda and Contra Costa County. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I also want to put in a plug for the Bumblebee Atlas as well, because I'm going to be hosting a in-person Bumblebee Atlas training on April 27th. and you can sign up for that. It's not up yet, but it will be also up on the East Bay Regional Park District website pretty soon. It's going to be on April 27th, and it'll be at a location, one of the East Bay parks in Oakland. So it should be central to those in the East Bay. So anyway, I just want to say thank you. Oh, and I want to say one other thing, and that is that this year we were able to get a couple of loaner kits out from Xerces Society. They gave us like these kits that had binoculars and some other things in there for folks. And one of our participants was very excited about that because, you know, was limited on funds, didn't have very good binoculars, and that enabled her to participate. So I also wanted to just say thank you for that as well. I know a lot of other places are getting these kits as well. So that was just very exciting for volunteers who want to get involved, who have reservations, but it's really becoming accessible for so many people to get out and help. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. We really appreciate you sharing out. We're so glad that you could make time to share that local perspective of the East Bay. So additionally, I want to give a huge thank you to all the regional coordinators like Susan who helped to, you know, connect with and train volunteers on the ground throughout the Western overwintering sites. So Mia Monroe coordinates the Bay Area and Northern California counties. Mia is also one of the co-founders of the Western Monarch Count that began in 1997 again. Huge thank you to Mia. Susan, you were here, shared out. Thank you for coordinating the East Bay along with Christina Garcia. Martha Nitzberg coordinates Santa Cruz County. And next slide. Natalie Johnston and Lisa Murphy coordinate the Monterey County area and are associated with the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History. Jessica Griffiths coordinates San Luis Obispo County and some sites in Santa Barbara County, has been doing this for many years alongside Karis Vanderhyde, who coordinates Santa Barbara County. Next slide. Kim also has joined and co-coordinates Santa Barbara County with Karis. We're so grateful to have you as well. Karen Sinclair coordinates Ventura County. Richard Rackman has now retired from his regional coordinator role as of this year, but is going on to pursue additional graduate work with pollinators and native plants and beyond. So Richard, thanks to you and Sarah who have helped coordinate the Los Angeles County. Next slide. Bob Allen, who coordinates Orange County, Melissa Stepik, who coordinates San Diego County. Thank you so much for counting monarchs in Southern California. Gail Morris of Southwest Monarch Study, who coordinates the Arizona regions and does tagging efforts as well. And Saul, thank you for joining us once again to coordinate Baja California, Mexico. We're so grateful to have you. And these monarch pictures are actually from Saul, who sent us some lovely photos and video footage of monarchs. So we'll hope to share some more of that out and credit Saul. And yeah, so stay tuned for that. Next slide. Additionally, I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to all the community scientists who participated this season. A few of you have already filled out our volunteer survey. And here's some beautiful photos of folks out counting sites with their families. It can really be a family or community event to get to know local spaces around your area. A few folks said that it was their first year. It was really fun hunting for butterflies, and we were shocked to look at our watches and see that we had already been out there for hours. So that was Aaron. Thank you for participating if you're on this webinar. John SB said they met several people that are passionate about monarch conservation and learned more about how local citizens can work with regional parks to add pollinator gardens to the parks. So glad that you walked away with additional knowledge and inspiration. And Dana said that they've learned a lot about habitat restoration after all the storms, and they're eager to be a part of that if they can. So we're so glad that this has inspired you to take action beyond community science counts. Next slide. And a huge thank you again to the hundreds of dedicated volunteers, partners, and funders who make our work possible. We've tried to list a few of the amazing funders that allows Xerces Society and other partners to offer resources, to train folks, to manage data, and so much more. So thank you to everyone who makes this work and effort possible each year. Okay, so we have a little time for questions now. We have a lot.
Yes, there are a lot of questions, so I will just dive right in. What is damage to overwintering sites?
Yeah, so damage to overwintering sites can include tree cutting or trimming, really anything that degrades the protective habitat that monarchs are seeking for the winter season. So Emma covered a few there, and then there's some other folks and coordinators on the call who have experienced and can share out about overwintering site degradation as well. I know Mia Monroe might be on this call. Mia, do you want to share about the Bolinas overwintering sites? If so, you could raise your hand, but we'll continue on. Let's see. Yeah, Mia Monroe has raised her hand. Rachel, would you mind? Perfect. Hi, Mia.
Hi, Isis. What a amazing count summary and covered so much. So first, thank you to all of you who presented and shared, not to mention all those amazing volunteers out there. But I gotta say, so many lessons this year, but also to speak to the point, there is nothing more disturbing and disheartening to arrive at an overwintering site, especially one that has monarchs, and see destruction, which happened to us at Kale. It's similar to what Emma was saying in Southern California, where we thought we had an agreement with PG&E, but there was something that went awry, and out came a significant tree that was blocking the wind into the site, and that was very, very disturbing. And then we had something similar at Purple Gate, a historic site that had only been able to host small numbers of monarchs recently because it was one of those deteriorating sites. And while we really understand the need for human safety and for people to protect their homes, it was just disturbing to see the trees taken out just as the monarchs were arriving. So it really is hard to see, and the need for plans and to work with property owners and to come up with alternatives and to strengthen sites is so critical. So thanks for letting me share some personal experiences we had in Bolinas. And there's also, good news. I think this is one of the first years when I've been able to share how many sites are actively getting renewed and restored and recovered, with specific attention to monarchs, such as Albany Hill, Ardenwood, San Leandro Golf Course. I mean, I can't even say that name anymore. Monarch Bay Golf Course, and Point Pinole, Fort Baker, just up in my area. It's very heartening to be able to share with people that they're now monitoring sites where active attention is being given to monarch conservation. So thanks, Xerces, for supporting all this, plus giving this additional thing that us volunteers can do, which is to report these. And hey, all of you listening, do your assessments. They're real important. Thank you, Isis.
Thanks so much for sharing out, Mia. We're so grateful to have your voice on here. I am going through we're going to stay a little bit past 12, just so you all know. And I'm answering questions in the Q&A box as well, but we'll continue answering them live too.
All right, next question. I think it's a good one. Exciting to hear that there have been more sites identified this winter. If someone thinks they found a site that may not be yet documented, who's the best person to report that to?
Yeah, so if you think that you know of a newly identified overwintering site that's undocumented, please email wmtc@xerces.org. I'll put that in the chat. Again, it's wmtc@xerces.org. And so this year during the Thanksgiving count, we had 4 newly identified overwintering sites added to our database. And during the New Year's count, we had one additional new site added, plus a handful of more sites that we need future survey efforts on that are like potential sites. So we may or may not have found clusters there, but we'll continue to monitor them.
All right, thank you. Next question, Isis, that you wanted to answer. Can you tell folks how to keep monarch caterpillars on their milkweed? They're big escape artists, and although they make the perfect milkweed implant area for them, they seem to leave.
Oh, yeah. So this is a tricky one. So I just wanted to remind everyone, currently in California, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife requires that folks are on a scientific permit to be able to handle monarch butterflies. This includes containing them within a net on their plants. So if you're worried about monarch caterpillars staying on your plants, don't worry. Monarch caterpillars naturally will mosey off to find a nice place to become a chrysalis and transform into a butterfly. So they might be inching around your garden. And also, you know, one of the important things about butterflies is that they're part of our natural ecosystems. So this doesn't apply to just monarchs, but I think over 70% of our native insectivorous birds rely on like caterpillars to survive. So I think if you're a butterfly person, you're probably also a lover of, you know, our birds as well. So just realize that, you know, monarch butterflies are producing a ton of eggs, a ton of caterpillars on purpose. They know that a bunch of these caterpillars are going to feed, well, they don't know this, I'm personifying them, but you know what? They produce a bunch of offspring, and it's, you know, part of that strategy, it comes with the understanding that some of them are not going to make it. However, they're still supporting other life forms that are really important. So again, you know, it might be hard when you're trying to protect one species particularly, but know that by creating this monarch and pollinator habitat, you're benefiting so many more native animals too.
Thank you, Isis. This next question was flagged by Emma. How can people ensure that their site or a site is protected under the ESHA?
Great. Yeah. I saw this came from you, Desiree. Thanks. So I think our biggest single bullet point to folks is that we know about 2/3 of the overwintering sites do fall within the coastal zone. And so in theory, the Coastal Commission has said that overwintering sites in the coastal zone can be considered ESHA, which is environmentally sensitive habitat area. However, unless there's a nexus directly with the Coastal Commission, generally that's not really getting recognized. And so we're finding that we need to kind of go down to whatever the local coastal plan level is and start to communicate with those folks. And there's kind of a mishmash of whether or not local coastal plans specifically call out overwintering sites as ESHA or not. So it's kind of one of those really boring legal issues. And I'll put I'll pop in the chat a blog I wrote a couple of years ago about it if you really want to get into the weeds. But I think really at this point, the bummer is that we've had to really kind of just address things as they come up. So Althouse and Mead, which is a great consultant that has a lot of overwintering experience, approached Santa Barbara County. I mean, it's the county with the most overwintering sites, some of the biggest overwintering sites. And they, along with one of our colleagues, gave their staff a training, their environmental planners a training to be like, this can be considered ESHA. Here's the resources. Here's what the monarchs need. So if a project comes across your desk and it, you know, and it overlaps with where monarch habitat is, like, you might have a tool to make sure that we don't destroy the habitat. So I think that's kind of where we're at. I've started conversations like Caltrans now. They've been really proactive, and they actually have been integrating our database of where overwinterings are in their maintenance planning tools. So somebody goes out, in theory, is going to like look up where there's listed species, but also where monarch habitat is, and then maybe make sure that they don't do road maintenance work. It's going to negatively impact habitat. So we're trying to kind of get proactive, but it's been very whack-a-mole. We've had a really hard time reaching utilities. I just had someone reach out to us from PG&E who was like, I want to do the right thing and get proactive. And I got so excited because usually it's us shouting into the dark with the utilities, being like, please don't. This is ESHA, please stop. So I think it really is that's one item that if for folks that are a little more policy minded or have connections with agencies in the coast, it's a great place where I think we need many hands starting to have those conversations. And sometimes it is really a case by case conversation around who owns this land, who manages this land, who leases this land? Are there multiple rights of ways? Like, how do we make sure all the stakeholders and anyone that could affect the trees, what do the neighbors know about this, and make sure everyone's on board? So I think it's a really powerful role the resource conservation districts can have in your communities, because you might know that. And then I wanted to I'll just answer another question I flagged where someone asked a great question of like, how many of these are private landowners? In terms of like individual owns, it's very much the minority. It's kind of interesting. We do not have it. It's not zero for sure. There are some big sites that are on private property, but there are a lot of sites that are not. So the biggest sites by far are owned by California State Parks. Vandenberg Space Force Base itself has like 30 overwintering sites. California Department of Fish and Wildlife, National Park Service, East Bay Regional Parks. So there's a lot of public agencies, which I think is really good news, because hopefully we can make some changes, you know, by making changes within those agencies. But there are some private landowners, and a lot of them do know they have overwintering sites. Sometimes they're the people that told us. We do have a few cases where, because ownership changed, we're not allowed on the property anymore. And that's true of a site we had kind of for many years. It's really unfortunate. It was a major site. And when it switched ownership, we're no longer allowed to survey. So we do try to, you know, do our best and with all of you, and thank you all for respecting it. I know we've instituted more no trespassing policies. We need to make sure we're not violating anyone's property rights or putting anyone in a liable situation. But in some cases, we can get estimates from public rights of ways. People, you know, can use binoculars to look in the trees from the sidewalk. So sometimes we're still getting counts on private property for a few of those, but in a lot of cases, it is the goodwill of those owners. And so I think we do have more work to do. And again, that's kind of those personal connections and building that into how we approach people in a respectful way. So if you know a private landowner who has an overwintering site and wants to get more involved, let us know. We've had a few people over the years join different groups and tried to provide people technical assistance and things like that. But it is kind of a minority in terms of the ownership across kind of the major big sites.
Thank you, Emma. Isis is rapidly answering these questions, which is great. So there is a question about doing a monarch count in New Mexico. I know you mentioned that there are some in Arizona, so I thought I'd throw New Mexico out there as well.
Yeah, Emma, maybe you know more, but as far as I'm aware of, I don't think we have any New Mexico overwintering counts. That said, we have lots of partners doing great work for monarch conservation and habitat establishment in New Mexico for the spring, summer, and fall migratory and breeding butterflies.
All right, thank you, Isis. We had a couple questions about different types of native trees, specifically why we think, or why you all think Western monarchs cluster on eucalyptus trees. Do they prefer eucalyptus over other native trees? And what are there trees that people could be planting that could maybe replace eucalyptus trees? As you said, they're not native and problematic for many reasons.
Yeah, so Emma can speak to the research on this, but we do have a guide now that I'll put in the chat. And one of our staff members, Sarah, put together a list of most of the overwintering trees and shrubs that we've noted, or our volunteers have noted in the Western Monarch Count surveys. So yeah, we often see eucalyptus and they're clustering on eucalyptus, but we've also had like top sites with the biggest counts show monarch clusters on redwood trees. We also see them on Western sycamore, Monterey pine, and cypress. I think some folks saw some on like poison oak foliage as well. So anyways, I popped a link in the chat with a new PDF going over some of the popular overwintering trees and shrubs if you'd like to check those out. Other trees can include like oak trees, like the coastal live oak tree. So please do check that out, and you can, if you live along the coast, you can install some of those native tree species if you have that ability. And in terms of eucalyptus, you know, I can't answer that question personally, but they have the long leaves, pretty good surface area for clinging to things, and nice canopies with wind protection. So that could potentially contribute.
Thank you, Isis. Did you have another coordinator that you wanted to chime in?
Oh yeah, so Lisa, if you are still on the call, I was wondering quickly before we continue to answer questions, if you would like to share about the Pacific Grove Butterfly Sanctuary or any highlights from Monterey County.
Hi, thanks, Isis. I just got a notification they might be testing our fire alarms, just to warn you all. But in Monterey County, we see a lot of our sites seem to be those fly-through sites where the butterflies are heading through here on their way someplace. But we have been diligently looking at all of those sites and think that's pretty important information to capture. We also very specifically look at the Pacific Grove Monarch Sanctuary site every week throughout the whole season. And we think that that granular data on over time, as well as which trees within that sanctuary we see the butterflies, is pretty important data for understanding how the monarchs are using this habitat and how that changes over time. It's a unique site. It's small. It's a mix of eucalyptus, Monterey pine, and cypress. And it's not subject to drought because there's a bunch of volunteers that run around watering the place all the time. So it's unique for a lot of reasons. And so we don't see a large drop in butterflies typically between Thanksgiving and New Year's in that site. So that's another way in which it's a pretty unique site. And we'll continue to monitor this and get this data to our UC Davis student who's looking at all of this. One of the challenges for us this year, however, is we still can't get to the southern end of our monitoring region in our county because Highway 1, there's still a landslide across Highway 1. So we've been just dependent on the collaboration of the whole group of monarch counters to get in there and get some of those sites counted. So thanks to everyone's assistance, and especially all of the volunteers across all of the monitoring sites who've done great work this season. Thanks, Isis.
Thank you so much. And you're not the only one struggling to get access to sites due to extreme weather events. Our folks in Saline Valley, California also had road closures from flooding events. So they were not able to get out to the sites this year. But you know what? We'll do the best we can.
All right, a few more questions here. I've had this question, actually, a few people have asked about the 2020 drop in monarchs. Could that possibly have been affected by fewer volunteers for tracking and because of COVID?
Emma, would you mind answering that?
Sure, yeah.
one?
I was busy chatting to sending another response to somebody, but yeah, I think that question very much I think that's a great one when looking at that dip, saying was it just a dip in effort, but we actually counted a lot of sites that year, and frankly I think people me and home, we had more engagement. We didn't have as many field events, but we actually had more people sign up and do virtual training. It was kind of our really big push to get our virtual trainings going, so we were able to have a lot of people go out and social distance and wear a mask and be 6 feet apart. So we actually think that we had good effort for that year, especially given the circumstances, and we just saw such a weird drop. So it was an unusually warm fall, unusually warm winter. There was really this emergence of a lot more overwintering resident monarchs in the East Bay. We heard so many anecdotes about what happened. So there's a really great paper by Elizabeth Kroon and Cheryl Schultz, where I think they put it in context, where they kind of talk about that phenomenon and like, was that an example of resilience of the population? Or is it kind of a preview of like a changing climate and warm winters, being kind of part of that catastrophe of, we saw this huge decline in how many actually overwintered. So pop that in the chat, but I think they raise a lot of questions. And I think someone else I answered just around question of like, are resident populations helping or hurting microtroid populations? Like, I think the truth is we don't know yet, but we have evidence that they're very highly diseased. very highly diseased in general if they're winter breeding. Good work over many years, both in the East and in the West, that really high rates of OE, which we know can kill or damage them. So I think what we're concerned about is like, sure, it looks great that you're like, I have butterflies in the winter, this seems good. But if long-term that's making the population weaker and monarchs that have high rates of OE aren't as successful at migrating, are we long-term doing damage? So there could be like short-term burst, they're feeding into the population. Long-term, are we adding disease and stressors? I think that's where the science is still out, and why, at least for us, the precautionary principle of let's plant native milkweed and let's replace that tropical milkweed with native milkweed to avoid this conundrum of winter breeding. And also there's a lot of tropical milkweed out there. So it's also just kind of this novel ecosystem we're living with. And I think we're going to learn more future years. And there's a wonderful graduate student, Emily Erickson at UC Davis, who just wrapped up a massive project trying to really think about this deeply in the East Bay. So I'm excited. I've seen like some of her preliminary results, but I'm hoping that she'll kind of elucidate this a little bit more. And I think somebody else asked, like, how could I get involved with that? I think reaching out to Emily would be a great idea. I don't want to give her email address away without permission yet, but I think she's really thinking about this deeply, as are others. And I think there's been some great work of just trying to tag and see movement. So I know Pollinator Posse in the East Bay has got a permit, and they're working to try and do some tagging, I think, with Gail Morris's tags of Southwest Monarch Study. So I think there are a few groups trying to think about this, and probably more to come.
Awesome.
Can I just add one other thing about the 2020 study? That was the year we had super, super big wildfires. And that's just another thought that other people think that might have really caused the migration population to be declining. So just want to throw that out as another possibility.
All right, it looks like there's a couple more questions we're just answering, typing in the chat quick. I'll ask this, the last question: has there been any research on monarchs adapting to use plants other than milkweed, specifically, obviously, for reproduction?
Ooh, I was gonna say there are definitely a couple like non-Asclepius plants they use, including balloon plant, which is non-native, and you'll find definitely in coastal California and some places. They also sometimes a trap is dogbane, but they don't make it to adulthood. So there are a couple other species, and there's a couple other ones in the desert that I'm totally forgetting, and our colleague Ray Morans would know off the top of his head. But in the Southeast, there are a couple others. Those are the two that pop out. I don't know, Isis or Susan, if you remember those other genus names. But I think in general, we're not seeing a lot of, I don't know about like evolution for it, but just like there are like trap plants where like essentially like they might be tempted to lay eggs, but then they don't grow up on them, or a couple that are outside of the Asclepius genus but are really similar that they can't use.
All right, thank you. I think I'll ask this one last question, and then we'll have to end for today. That Chris posed, if there's been any studies done in areas of large established stands of tropical milkweed and OE amounts when a rigorous maintenance schedule of pruning back has been adopted.
I don't want to take over. I was just going to say no. I think that'd be cool. I think we all think that that's probably the best way to handle it. If you have a big stand, if you can manage it by cutting it down, break the disease cycle, that would be, I think that'd be really great. And I think it'd be helpful. That's really our advice to people that have it and want to keep it, is at least cut it back and break that cycle. So it'd be great if we had more data to show how effective that is.
That's good, because Chris has the opportunity to collect data from a site like that. So thank you, Chris. Well, thank you all so much for this wonderful presentation. It was great. We got through all of our questions. There will be a follow-up email coming from Zoom to your inbox. Well, I will include all of the links that have been put in the chat. Feel free to check out our website and go to the Western Monarch Count website as well for more information. But thank you so much, Isis, Emma, Susan, and all of the volunteers who made this count possible. We couldn't do without you all. So I hope you all have a great, wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.